Hello and welcome to week 6 of Mondays with Miss E. Start with my t-shirt this week. I've got my t-shirt this week. Sorry, I'm getting some. Okay, sorry about that. So my t-shirt this week, my book themed t-shirt. This is another flying related t-shirt, which say is book related because Miss E certainly has an airplane theme to it. So the chapter I'm going to read this week is definitely a good chapter to read while wearing a flying themed t-shirt. And you'll see why in a little bit. Couple things, lots to talk about today. So I didn't mention last week we met Miss E and discovered that she is actually Amelia Earhart, and there was a mixture of kind of fictional Miss E character and true to life Amelia Earhart information, and I really tried to as much as I can mix in some of that that factual Amelia Earhart information, even though we're really dealing with a made up character, a fictionalized character. So things like the tomato juice, and we're going to see that again in this chapter. That is actually something that when Amelia Earhart was on long distance flights, she didn't drink coffee; she drank tomato juice. And things like the picture of her navigator, Fred Newton, her nickname, her younger sister called her Mealy, and that was a nickname that stuck. So I tried where I can to kind of mix in some of that, and we'll keep seeing that a little bit as we see more of Miss E. So the flying that we're going to see in today's chapter, a lot of that writing is based on my personal experience. My father was a pilot, recreational pilot. So he had just a small, like a 4-seater airplane. But I grew up flying in his airplane, and if I was lucky, I would get to sit in the front seat next to him. And there were a dual set of controls. So there were pedals at my feet and a yoke in front of me. And every once in a while he would offer me the chance to fly. And this, I was this little kid and my feet probably didn't even touch the pedals. But I got to put my hands on the yoke and turn it and push it in and pull it back and feel how that changed the plane and pointed the plane in a different direction or made it go down or made it go up. And that really stuck with me. So we're going to see a little bit of that in today's chapter. I was also lucky enough to be able to take a flight, take like a practice flight in an aircraft, not quite like what we're going to see in today's chapter. Not an old rickety old airplane, but an airplane that was flown with a stick versus a yoke, and the difference there is that everything your side to side and your forward and back motion is controlled with that one stick, and then your feet on the pedal. So the controls were a lot more like what I'm describing in the book, and it was also just really great to have that recent experience when I sat down to write this chapter, to have those memories of when I was flying as a child, but then also to have that much more recent flying experience. So that's a little bit about the flying in today's chapter. This is a long chapter today. I've been reading 2 or 3 chapters, and today it's just one chapter. Chapter breaks, I feel like, the chapters end, I guess, at a point that makes the most sense for the story, where I feel like there's a logical break in what's happening in the story. And a lot of times there's a shift in time or a shift in scene when you move to the next chapter. This is one of the few chapters where there is that shift in time. We're seeing the first half of the chapter, Beth's meeting with Miss E midweek when she delivers groceries, and then we're seeing another meeting on the weekend. So there is that shift in time, but I felt like there was enough connection between those two meetings that I kept it in a single chapter. So that made for a chapter that's longer than most of the chapters in the book, but I felt like there was enough continuity in the story of this in this chapter to keep it all in one. So this chapter is called Perspective, and again, I had a lot of fun finding short 1-2 word titles for all the chapters that were meaningful, that gave a little bit of hint about the chapter. And I think this chapter title really kind of has two different meanings. It starts out, I think, with Beth's feeling like Missy wants to change her perspective on her mother and the way she feels toward her mother. But about halfway through the chapter, she gets a very different perspective, and that is from up in the air in an airplane. So two different meanings there. All right, without further ado, here is today's chapter, Perspective. After meeting the long-lost Amelia Earhart and seeing her airplane hidden away in a barn for 30 years, instead of being at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean somewhere, most people would think that their lives would change somehow, that knowing a famous person and being let in on an amazing secret would rub off on them and make them famous or amazing too. Those people would be wrong. The day after I sat down in Amelia Earhart's kitchen, heard her story, and climbed into her Electra to watch her warm up its engines, I pretty much did what I did any other Thursday. And thinking about being in the Electra with its engines roaring, while the 3 books the Forestville Library had on the subject were sitting on Amelia Earhart's kitchen table, well, that was a little distracting during classes, but I was still in my classes. I still rode my bike to school and delivered groceries that afternoon. No one came knocking at my door for an interview or stopped me on the street for my autograph. I still had homework to do, and my mother was still unemotional and uninvolved. I didn't tell anyone in history class that I had figured out the Amelia Earhart photograph. We still had about 30 to name, so adding one more to our list wouldn't get us the prize. But mostly, she still felt like a secret, and me knowing who the photograph was seemed a part of that. Sure, I could say I figured it out and not tell anyone that I had actually met her, but for me, knowing who the person in the photograph was and actually meeting the person were all rolled into one. Besides, if I figured out the photograph, I'd also have to write about her importance in 20 words or less. Amelia Earhart lives on a farm outside Forestville, California, where she is hiding her plane in a barn. 18. To despair. She's alive! Exclamation point. Do contractions count as one word or two? I thought about riding my bike out to Miss E's farm. My last trip there certainly went beyond just delivering groceries, so I didn't really need to wait for another delivery day, but something made me feel like time needed to pass. After all, 30 years was a long time to go without telling anyone your story. Missy was likely not interested in a follow-up interview. I dared to hope for another chance to sit in her plane again, and at the time, I wondered if I'd even get a seat at the kitchen table again. I replayed the day, concerned that I'd gone too far in asking to see her plane, or that Miss E had let me too far into her story and would decide instead to shut me out. But all I could do was wait. I went to school, I delivered groceries, and I hung out with Cassie, Ann, and Susan on the weekend. The only thing that happened of any significance was a letter from my father that arrived on Saturday. He wrote regularly, but regular for a father was not often. That was okay. Not much of my father came through in his letters. Just like talking to him when we were sitting in the same room, what he said was only a small part of what he communicated. How he stood or sat, his expressions and gestures, what words he said quietly or quickly or slowly, and what words he didn't say. None of that came through in the letters. Yet my mother still folded them carefully after she read them aloud to me, and then she'd walk off with them to put them somewhere, I guess. I didn't think she'd just throw them out, but I never saw them again. Part of me wondered if she was really reading what was on the page, or if she was filtering and putting her own twist on my father's words. I wondered, but wasn't about to go snooping in my mother's dresser drawers for my father's letters. But I missed him all the time. Like the refrain that ran through my head in the weeks before my father left, my father, now being gone, was a thought that worked its tendrils into every part of my day. When I rode my bike to school or out on deliveries, I thought of my father and the day he gave me the bike. A good grade on a test only forced me to remember that he wouldn't be home that evening for me to proudly show it to him. I had a drawer full of tests and essays waiting for him when he returned. School and friends and Mr. Flynn's pictures were small distractions. Miss E and her Electra were bigger ones, but even they couldn't push thoughts of my father entirely from my mind. When Wednesday finally rolled around again, and I was boxing Miss E's groceries for delivery, it felt like any other delivery day, but I didn't want it to be. I had a sinking feeling that I would arrive at her door only to find another envelope and no invitation to come in. Or if I was invited in, that there would only be awkward conversation, like running into a boy outside a classroom after a first date gone wrong. As I pedaled out to the dirt road and turned onto it, heading for her farm, I rehearsed conversations in my head. What I might ask her and what she might answer. I tried out several to make sure I was ready for anything, but I had no way of planning for what was to come. There was no envelope stuck in the screen door, so I knocked and felt comfortable enough to open the door and walk in before I heard her reply. There was movement back in the kitchen, so I just walked back and found Miss E in the kitchen, pouring 2 mugs of tomato juice. Good to have you here again, Bets. Wasn't quite sure if you were going to show up at my doorstep again the very next day, or if I was never going to see you again, but you got it just right, huh? I smiled and shrugged and put the box of groceries down on the countertop, satisfied that my week of patiently waiting and wondering had been acknowledged. Help yourself to a chair, she said as she sat down and placed the 2 mugs on the table. Looking forward to hearing your story. I hesitated until the silence in the room became uncomfortable. My what? Well, come on, Bets. I already decided you're the most interesting person in town, always paling around with a group of girls for ice cream or pizza, riding your bike wherever you go, and knocking out the school's pain in the shorts with one punch. I suppose Forestville hasn't seen anything like you since... She paused and smiled. Well, since I came to town, I guess. I thought about what she was asking for and then said quickly, I don't have a story. Oh, Bets, don't be silly. Everyone's got a story. It just doesn't seem like a story to you because it's your day to day and you're living it. I thought about that, and I thought about all the talking Miss E had done the week before. She told me a story that would rival anything that was in the Forestville library, but to her, it was just something that happened in life. I thought about my dad and my mother, and then I started talking. I talked for a long time, longer than I thought possible, long enough to finish my tomato juice and have Miss E pour seconds. I told Miss E about the last few places we lived, but not because those places were really important to me, just because they'd give her an idea of my moving around from place to place. I told her about my father in Vietnam and my mother who seemed unchanged through it all, unemotional, unresponsive. But I didn't say that. Instead, I told her in a cheerful voice how my mom was making the time without my father easier by telling stories about him at the dinner table. She just sat still through most of what I said, nodding a couple times and sipping her tomato juice. But when I talked about my mother, she gave a quick like she was only half listening. I wasn't sure how much eye contact I was making, though through the first part of the story, but I realized I was having trouble looking Miss E in the eye while I talked about my mother. Finally, she stopped my monologue by standing up and taking our mugs to the sink. I've got a feeling you're only giving me half a story, Bets. You sure that's how things are between you and your mother? I shrugged my reply. Well, Bets, it seems like you need a change of perspective. I said nothing, only looking at her with confusion on my face and waiting for her to explain. You have anything taking up your time this weekend other than visits to the pizza place and the ice cream parlor? She asked, and I shook my head. Good then. Come on over here Saturday morning and we'll see what we can do about your perspective. I protested a little and tried to ask her questions about what she meant, but she cut me off, and before I knew it, I was on her front porch with the screen door slapping closed behind me. I dreaded the weekend. I was certain that Miss E knew what I'd said about my mother was a lie, and come Saturday, I would be lectured on respect for adults and how parents are always right. At one point, I broke out in a cold sweat when it occurred to me that Miss E could actually invite my mother out to her farm, and I would be confronted by both of them when I entered the house. But what I found on Saturday morning was completely unexpected. When I coasted my bike into the driveway Saturday morning, Miss E was coming out of the house with a basket. She put it in the back of the red pickup and then turned to greet me. Good to see you, Bets. Didn't tell you what time, but you got it just right, huh? I shrugged and smiled as if to say that I did indeed get it just right, but that I didn't really mean to and felt a little uncomfortable being complimented for it. My father would have understood all that. Well, Bets, sometimes things happen just right, and we might as well take credit for them. Apparently, my father and Miss E spoke the same language. I was expecting a long conversation at the kitchen table, so I was surprised when Miss E opened the pickup door and climbed in. The window was already rolled down, and she called through it. Come on, Bets, stop wasting the day and get in. Still trying to figure out why we weren't going into the house for the lecture I'd been expecting, I leaned my bike on the kickstand and climbed into the pickup next to Miss E. No small part of me was relieved that I did not go back in time. I had looked Missy in the eye, and I had gone into her house, and now I was sitting in her pickup. Despite the eerie feeling I had when I saw them for the first time, neither person, house, nor pickup had the ability to time travel after all. I think maybe because the driver was as old as the truck, I'd assumed we'd be taking a slow drive with careful turns and long pauses at stop signs. I was in her seat, flew airplanes cross-country at a time when most people had never even seen one. I'm not sure Miss E would have passed a driving exam with her loose observance of the speed limit and the number of stop signs she rolled through, but once we were out on open country roads, her driving made the pickup seem like it was on autopilot while we chatted and enjoyed the scenery. We drove long enough that I'd lost track of time. I hadn't really explored very far outside Forestville. I could only ride so far on my bike, and my mother never really went anywhere, so I had a very limited mental map of the area. We went through a couple places that I guess were small towns, but anyone who didn't live there would probably drive right through without knowing it. Mostly, there was a lot of open country, and only a couple of the roads we drove on were paved. We turned off one of the paved roads when we passed a sign with an airplane on it, and then bounced along on a rutted dirt lane for a few minutes before we pulled into an open field with a few airplanes clustered around a small building. With a sinking stomach, I realized what Miss E could mean by a change of perspective. We got out of the pickup and Miss E grabbed the basket from the back of the truck. We walked toward the cluster of planes, and I noticed for the first time a man perched on a ladder and leaning most of his body into the engine of the plane parked closest to the building. "Morning, Fred. Going to take the duster up this morning if that's okay." The man pulled his head out of the engine compartment, and his body seemed to unfold itself as he stepped to the ground. He pushed the hat back on his head to reveal a smiling face. "Sure, Mealy. She's gassed up and ready to go, although I don't have any dusting to do today. No matter. Just going to take my young friend for a look-see above the clouds." Miss E was gesturing toward me. The man acknowledged what she'd said with a quick nod and then disappeared back into the engine he was working on. My mind raced with the information it had been given. His name, his face, what I'd read in the Amelia Earhart books, and what Miss E had told me. The conclusion was simple. Fred Noonan. "Fred Noonan?" I said out loud. "Quiet," Miss E snapped. "Not right to talk about someone while you're still close enough for them to hear." She seemed to wait a few steps before continuing. "That's Fred, all right. He had to go somewhere after we returned from our flight, and he picked here. There was no getting away from flying for Fred. For me neither, I suppose. He came here to manage this airfield, and he keeps busy with some crop dusting jobs and some small cargo flights when someone needs something to go someplace else in a hurry. He lets me fly the duster on some of the jobs, and sometimes just for fun. Since we were walking toward it, I figured that the red plane with a double set of wings parked to the side of the building was the duster. What showed of the motor looked old and greasy, and the wings seemed to sag under their own weight. There were spots of new paint, as if holes in the skin of the plane had been patched and painted over carelessly. I had never been on a plane before. My father had, of course, and he worked on planes all the time. I always figured I would have the chance to fly eventually, but I didn't expect it to be in an open cockpit plane that looked like it would never get off the ground. Miss E must have read my mind. "Oh, the duster doesn't look like much, but it's a good plane. Never had a bad scare in it yet, and don't expect to." I raised my eyebrows, wondering what the difference between a scare and a bad scare was, but Miss E had already turned her back on me to climb into the plane. She lifted a foot and hopped up on the wing with an ease that surprised me. Before I knew it, she was seated in the plane and looked at me expectantly. I stammered, searching for a reason not to get in the plane. My mother, I guess, I don't think my mother would want me to," I said, finally deciding that using my mother as an excuse was my best bet. "Bets, you and I both know your mother won't be finding out about this. We also know that you wouldn't let your mother stop you from something you wanted to do. Climb on in." Admitting defeat, I struggled to pull myself onto the wing and then carefully inched along until I could grasp the edge of the cockpit and pull myself toward it. My next concern was that Miss E had made herself at home in the rear seat, leaving the front seat for me. The worry must have shown on my face. "Don't worry yourself, Bets. I'll be steering from back here. You can sit yourself up there and enjoy the view." With that, I took a deep breath and climbed in. I thought the Electra was loud. The duster took the prize. The engine coughed twice and the propeller turned slowly. Then it roared to life, turning the blades in front of me into a blur. The seat below me shook. My teeth vibrated, and holding onto the edges of the cockpit only sent the vibrations up my arms. There were a few dials in front of me, duplicates of what Miss E had behind, I figured. I couldn't imagine how they did her much good, though, since the needles bounced furiously, and I had to squint to read them. There was a control stick between my legs as well, also a duplicate of Miss E's. That seemed to be the only thing in the plane that wasn't jumping up and down, only tilting slightly side to side as the plane made a turn here and there on its way out to the runway. Knowing that Miss E had a firm hand at the controls was enough to allow me a small breath of relief. The duster made a quick turn and then slowed to a stop, although the engine still made the air thick with noise. I figured we'd reached the runway and Miss E was pointing the plane toward the other end. My view out the front was only sky, since the duster's tail dragged low to the ground on a single small wheel, and the taller front wheels under the wings pointed the nose far above the horizon. I could only crane my neck to see out the sides and behind. "Ready, Bets?" Missy's voice shouted behind me, almost lost in the roar of the engine. I didn't think I could manage a voice loud enough to be heard, and instead meekly raised my hand in a thumbs-up gesture. The engine couldn't possibly get louder, and then it did. I noticed a knob on the panel in front of me move as if it were being pulled out by an invisible hand, and I realized it was mirroring Miss E's as she pulled out her throttle and turned the low, grumbling roar into a high-pitched whine. At first, the duster stood still, reminding me of the Electra trapped back in the barn, and then we slowly began to roll forward again, faster and faster, until the blur of fields outside the cockpit matched the whine of the engine. The plane tilted forward as the small tail wheel lifted off the ground, and the view suddenly opened up in front of me. The small building and the other planes were ahead of us, but we approached them so quickly, almost as soon as I'd noticed them, we were passing them by and leaving them behind. The big front wheels were bumping along the grass runway, and then they weren't. Just like that, we were in the air. And just as quickly, the engine quieted and the vibration stopped, as if the duster had been working with all its might to move along the ground at such a speed. And now that it was in the air and back in its element, it could relax. My eyes couldn't look in enough directions fast enough. In a breath, the field ahead of us disappeared and was replaced by a forest, and then another field behind that, and a small stream to the side, and then a river that the stream must flow into. And then, I think, through the haze of miles of empty air, mountains showed their silhouettes against the sky. But each second I looked, there was more to see. I twisted my neck to both sides and struggled to see something that we'd just flown over as it slipped away behind, only to snap my gaze back to the front so I didn't miss what was coming next. I thought Missy was shouting behind me, and I struggled to hear, and then realized she was laughing and cheering. I twisted in my seat and could see her face behind the small windshield that was between us. She was smiling and had one hand raised in the air as if she was catching the air as it flowed past. I'd seen kids at school that were old enough to drive do the same in convertibles. They thought they were having the time of their lives. They had no idea what they were missing. I couldn't resist raising my own arms above my head and letting out a cheer of my own. I wiggled in my seat as I flapped my imaginary wings in the air and was surprised when my foot pushed into something on the floor. The plane reacted immediately. We turned to the left, but it was like the front half of the plane was still trying to pull us straight ahead, while the tail was steering us someplace else. In one motion, my foot jumped off the pedal like it was on fire, and I turned in my seat to look at Miss E and make sure everything was okay. When I did, my knee caught the control stick, pushing it forward and to the side. Again, the plane's reaction was immediate. The nose of the plane dropped down and the whine of the engine increased, like we were picking up speed. At the same time, we rolled to the left, and I was suddenly looking out the side of the plane at the ground below us. I scrambled for something on the opposite side to hold on to, forgetting the seatbelt that was buckled firmly across my waist. Then, as quickly as we had turned and tilted, we were straight and level again. Woo-hoo! That was exciting, huh? You having fun, Bets? Miss E called from behind with a laugh in her voice. Too nervous to take my hands off the edge of the cockpit, I only nodded. The view outside had changed. We'd come closer to the ground in the short second that the plane was tipping, and I wondered how many more seconds we would have been in the air if Miss E hadn't straightened things out. I was suddenly very happy to have a world-famous pilot at the controls behind me. All's well, Bets. We needed to start making some turns anyway. Nothing wrong with flying in a straight line when you have someplace to go, but if that's all we're going to do, we might as well be driving on a road. Go ahead, Bets. Take the stick. I shook my head repeatedly, but Missy's shouts of encouragement from behind finally convinced me. Gradually, I slipped my right hand off the edge of the cockpit and curled my fingers around the control stick. I immediately felt the plane in my hand. There was resistance in the stick, and even though my knee had pushed it easily, I could feel that pushing it now, in a way, would be like pushing the whole plane. Then my stick moved slightly to the left, and I knew Miss E was moving hers. The pedal under my right foot moved as well and bumped into my toe. I lifted both feet and rested them gently on the pedals, getting the same feeling of resistance that would move the plane if I wanted it to. We made a slow banked turn, and it felt right this time, like the wings and tail and propeller were all working together. Then the stick came back to center and the pedals leveled out under my feet, and with them the plane came back to straight and level. We made the same gentle turn in the other direction, and I felt less like Missy's movements were controlling mine and more like I was moving with her. Your turn, Bets! I heard the shout from behind me. I hesitated, ready to shake my head no, but nodded instead. The stick moved more easily, and I guessed that Miss E had removed her hand from it, though I'd hoped it was hovering near, ready to grab it, in case I did something wrong. I mimicked the movements we'd just made, feeling more comfortable with the plane's shift and tilt because I knew it was coming, and I was causing it. River! I heard from the back seat, and when I had no reaction, she shouted again, River! My eyes caught the distant silver strip ahead to the left, and I pointed the plane toward it. I felt Miss E nudging the stick forward slightly and gradually bringing us closer to the ground. It was a whole different scene. Farmhouses stood out in detail, and instead of forests or fields just being patches of green, I could now see individual trees or rows of crops. Then we were over the water, and I was moving the stick slowly to one side and the other, following the gentle course of the river as it wound into the hills. Wow, that was just fine, Bets. Very well done. I could feel Miss E's hand on the stick and took mine off to give her back full control. I didn't want to give up the feeling, didn't want the sense of being connected to the plane and the air around it to stop, but before I took my hand off, I promised myself plainly, I will do this again. I was back to enjoying the scenery when the engine sound changed. First, a hiccup, quick enough to make me think I'd imagined it. Then it happened again and again until the engine was running noticeably rougher. The ground was closer and the duster now seemed less at home in the air. The rough engine coughed again and then stopped. Except for the air whistling around us, we were suddenly plunged, the wind like a child's pinwheel. The engine cranked once, and then again before Miss E shut it off entirely. No worries, Bets, a cheerful voice called from the rear cockpit. Seatbelt buckled? I gave a quick nod and turned around to see the same woman who had been sitting next to me in the Electra, eyes smiling and hair tousled in the wind. Miss E gave me a thumbs up. There was simply no way the woman behind me spent her days listening to quiet music in her armchair and sipping tomato juice in her kitchen. I saw in her at that moment the same energy and spirit that the crowds gathered at airfields to see 40 years ago, and that my classmates walked by each day in their history classroom without noticing. The ground was very close now. Trees that were just green patches minutes ago were now close enough to see individual branches that whipped by in a blur. Forest was on either side, and the river was still below us, but we were low enough that my view of the land ahead had been shortened to nothing. Then we were below the treetops, and the trees formed two thick green walls on either side of us. I could see the flaps on the wings moving constantly, and I was afraid to speak, knowing that Miss E must be working the controls furiously. But I wanted to hear her voice and be reassured by it. "No worries," she said again. I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or if she was telling herself, but it made me feel better nonetheless. The river we were following widened ahead, then split, and when we reached that spot, Miss E turned the plane to the left and took what looked like the smaller of the two branches. The trees were closer in, and the branches struck one of the wingtips before Miss E centered the plane over the narrower strip of water. Then the forest disappeared on our left. The stream bent away to the right and took the trees with it. We found ourselves in the bright sun of a cornfield, just as the wheels slapped against the tall stalks. We sunk further into the corn, and then the wheels were bumping along the rutted ground while the wings plowed through the stalks, and the still pinwheeling propeller chewed them into dust. We hit a low spot that bumped us briefly into the air again, sailed over an open swath in the field that looked like a farm road, and came to a shuddering halt amongst the corn on the other side. I kidded myself that it was sheer luck, that Miss E had made it depending solely on luck. She would have used hers up long ago. Dust hung in the afternoon sun, the air suddenly silent and still. I heard Miss E pull herself from the cockpit, and then saw her climb over onto the wing and hop nimbly to the ground. She looked up at me with a smile on her face and her hands on her hips. "Well, come on, Bets. Not the place I had in mind for our picnic, but it seems like it will do." All right, so that is today's chapter. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you here next week.